Great. Thank you so much, Mia and Tadaima, for having us here today. My name is Debby Kajiyama, and I'm really excited to be here with author and choreographer Kimiko Guthrie, whose debut novel, Block 17, has just been published by Blackstone Publishing. Kimi is the co-founder of a performance company called Dandelion Dance Theater, and her work has been presented in the United States and also internationally. And she's also a lecturer at California State University, East Bay. We actually met, what year was it that we met, Kimi? I forgot to check with you. Like, was it around 98?
Yeah, I was going to say 98. I think so.
And we met in the dance world, actually, and I had the honor of dancing in some of your pieces. And one of the most compelling parts of your choreographic work, I feel like, is how you integrate story and text into performance. So I guess it's not that surprising that you've now written your first novel, which is very exciting. So I'm so happy that you invited me to come and talk with you today. I'm wondering if we
could... Yeah, I've loved working with you over the years, so I'm really excited to talk to you, and thanks for doing this.
Of course, yeah. Maybe we could just start by you telling us what the book is about and what kind of was the inspiration behind writing the book.
Sure, yeah. Block 17 is a story that's kind of been inside me, I guess, for many years now. In fact, the piece that we met in 1998 doing a piece called Mio in the Middle, which was in a way, I think, an early draft almost for me of this story, Block 17, which explores my own family history. My mom was incarcerated at the Rower camp, Rower, Arkansas internment camp as a little girl. So growing up, I kind of always heard her talking about it and my family talking about, what they called camp in various ways. And as a kid, of course, it's confusing. You're hearing these little glimpses of stories. And often the stories that I heard were almost cheerful stories or like, cheerful reminiscences. And so as, when I got a little older and started learning about more of the history, I guess it was kind of a strange dichotomy trying to reconcile these two camps in my mind, the camp that I had heard little kind of glimmers of growing up, and then, what I learned about more from a mature perspective. So I've always wanted to tell this story in one way or another. And with Block 17, I was really compelled to tell a story from my current day perspective, which I started writing it in 2012. So it's now not exactly current, but I wanted to tell it through the lens of somebody of my generation to kind of get at not only what happened back then, but to kind of look at how a trauma kind of can have ripple effects through the generations, and how especially unspoken trauma, when somebody doesn't necessarily have all the pieces of the puzzle to put together. I wanted to kind of explore the effects of that, this kind of fragmented past, and kind of looking at Jane / Akiko, the main character's perspective. So the story takes place in kind of current day and also back in the 1940s.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And can you talk a little more about the inspiration for? It's a work of fiction, you say?
Definitely, yeah. Definitely it's fiction. But also, as I was saying, inspired by my memories of my family talking and sometimes not talking about their experiences in the Rower incarceration camp. And I actually had dug up a couple pictures that I wanted to share. My Ji-chan, my grandfather, actually had a video camera or a movie camera. And so this is my Ji-chan here as a young man. He came to this country in the early 1900s along with and then my grandmother was a picture bride. My Bachan, she followed in 1917. They were from the same village. She came to this country as a picture bride. And I think we might have a couple pictures of her here. This is one of my favorite pictures of her, I believe, right before she left Totori-ken, which is the prefecture where she's from. And then I like this other picture of her as well, wearing this hat. I like that it's a little bit different than some of the images I've seen from that period. She was a very strong woman, a tough woman, kind of a tomboy. As a kid, she had, her name is Ito, which was traditionally a boy's name. There's a whole story about that. But anyway, so I was always very interested in my grandparents' stories. And in college, I actually got a grant to interview my family members about their internment experiences. And then as I started writing in 2012, I was really just writing again because I was seeing so many connections also between, unfortunately, then and now in terms of treatment of immigrants, the kind of demonization of immigrants, and racial profiling, and also the sense of surveillance that goes on so much in our current day world now in the digital age. So much of the time we are under surveillance without necessarily realizing it and realizing all of the maybe insidious effects that that's having on us. So I found some interesting parallels between back then and now that I wanted to bring out in this story.
Yeah, definitely. I felt so when I read it, I guess it's been about a month or so now since I read it, I felt like we're in this time of COVID where all of our activities are going on like this on a screen.
Yeah.
And it just felt like the book resonated so much. It's almost like it was predicting what was going to happen or something, or maybe writers just had the pulse on the world and culture. So, but yeah, it was very kind of an eerie coincidence about what's happening now.
Yeah, it was interesting because as I said, I started writing it during the Obama era, already seeing a lot of, I was already alarmed in many ways about our political situation. But then, 2016 came and just so many, unfortunately, so many more themes in the novel started to feel more relevant. But then suddenly the pandemic and how we're all now interacting virtually, I never would have predicted that. And it feels ironic to me because so much of the novel for me was in a way, I guess, kind of looking at how important it is to be in our physical bodies and to be wary of, having all of our kind of most intimate interactions mediated by these big tech companies. And now here we are, that's kind of all we're doing. Of course, I'm grateful to be able to have this, this exchange and to be able to be connected to people during this time of isolation, but it does feel strange. Yeah,
it's true. There are positive things like all of the Tadaima programming.
Yeah.
Accessible to us now. It's really great.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So I wanted to hear a little bit about the process of writing your first novel. Like you're a choreographer who did a lot of writing also, but how was it for you to write the book and just practically, and then also going on to get it published and all of that? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. It did feel in a way like a practical switch to me in a way, because as you know so well, rehearsing for dance performances, there's a lot of coordinating with other people's schedules. It's very collaborative. That's what I love about it. But once I had my second child and I was also teaching, it felt like too much to juggle for me to schedule rehearsals. So I was like, what can I do where I still get to express myself creatively, but I can just do it whenever I'm alone for a few minutes. So I started writing, I think, this novel partly because of those practical considerations. And I was very lucky to have my parents around. They would babysit my baby on Tuesday mornings, and I would go to a cafe and I would have 3 hours to write every Tuesday morning. So that was kind of how this started, and I think partly why it's taken so long. I think if I had had more time to write, it would have been a lot quicker. But I'm also grateful for that because I think it allowed me to kind of live within the world of the novel for longer and to kind of get feedback and to kind of revisit it. So I'm grateful that it ended up taking a while. And, as you said, I'm used to being in the room with bodies, collaborating with other people. So it was a very different process. But I was actually, the more I kind of delved deeper into the writing process, it started feeling more and more similar in a way to dance to me. And that, first of all, it wasn't a solitary process. In fact, I had you read a draft of it, and I had many friends give me feedback, people I trusted artistically. And then also, it just felt more and more like, even working with the words on the page, I started thinking of it as its own visual art, just kind of playing with, the spaces and almost like even the shapes of the letters sometimes had their own energy to me. But also, just definitely there was a sense of rhythm, as we have in dance, and movement of spirit and energy. So I was actually really excited to kind of find those similarities between dance and writing.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if it's because I know you from the dance world originally, but just a lot of the descriptions in the book are so rich, and they're about like a physical experience of being disoriented, or like being in really a hot place, or being stifled or contained in a certain way. So it felt very like a physical experience to me.
Cool.
And I'm wondering about the process of getting the book published. So I've always heard from other writer friends or people who teach writing, for example, that it's hard to break in no matter who you are. But sometimes if you're a person of color, or if you're maybe writing something that's not of sort of the mainstream narrative kind of style, that it's harder to break in to get a book published. And I was just curious if you experienced that, or not so much.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, for me as a first-time writer, of course, it's hard to compare kind of, I think part of why it took me so long to find an agent and to find the publisher. So it took, I thought I was done writing in 2015, which is when I started kind of shopping it around. But I think it is extremely hard, no matter who you are, to get published, which I'm kind of glad I didn't realize that when I started out. I was a little naive. I thought, oh, there's so many books in the world, it must not be too hard. But I think it is just difficult. But I think that what you're saying, there is something to that I'm really happy right now. I'm hearing lots of people kind of think much more consciously about trying to get more representation within the publishing industry, and to try to just have more diversity. Because one thing that I did hear a lot of times when I would, submit my manuscript to a potential agent was, I really love the story, I love the themes, but I just don't quite relate. I can't really relate to the voice, and I really need to see myself in the story. And I do feel that, on the one hand, I do think there was some wonderful feedback that I got from lots of agents that I got rejections from. Actually, I ended up integrating a lot of their feedback, and that helped to make the story stronger. But I also did have this sense, I was listening to an interview with the Pulitzer Prize winning author of The Sympathizer, Viet Thanh Nguyen. And he said something that really struck me, and I heard him at a really crucial time. I was kind of probably 2/3 of the way through my process. And he was talking about this issue and about kind of representation. And he really encouraged writers of color, or people speaking maybe not from a mainstream perspective, not to kind of translate your work or to water it down in a way to make it kind of accessible, but really to keep your integrity and to tell your story. I think he says something about write as though you are with the privilege of the majority, but the humility of the minority, something like that. Anyway, and it really did kind of bring attention for me to that idea that we do need more diversity within the industry, because if we only have people of one kind of person who wants to relate to see themselves in a story, then we're only going to see one type of story. So hearing his words did encourage me to kind of really try to keep true to the voice of my character, even though people weren't necessarily relating to that voice immediately.
Right. I feel when I read it, I felt so connected to it personally. Just a lot of sort of the silencing of stories that then come out or impact the next generations, I felt like kind of like I couldn't put it down. It was compelling. And
Yeah.
when we were talking earlier, and you were mentioning that, of course, all authors want readers to feel connected to what they write, but that you were particularly wanting to see how the Japanese American community received your book and thought about your book. And I was wondering if you wanted to say a little bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You know, I feel like my story is about a mixed race person like myself, who's kind of, I guess, struggling with identity between these different worlds. And one thing that I guess that I love when I'm reading literature, and that I'm always attracted to as an artist, is a main character who isn't necessarily likable or who is complex. You know, I love main characters who maybe whose choices I might not make in my life, but I like to be put in the mindset of somebody else, especially somebody who's going through issues or going through, you know, blocks. And for me, my main character is definitely not a noble character necessarily. She's experiencing the effects of the trauma that she's inherited, and that trauma isn't always necessarily comfortable to be with. So, you know, Jane / Akiko definitely isn't an enlightened character, at least, you know, at the beginning. And I think there was a part of me that was a little afraid of that, because I think sometimes when we're writing about an oppression, you know, an act of whether it's the government or some other entity that has inflicted suffering on people, there's maybe a tendency to want to see the victims of that oppression in a good light, of course, but sometimes I think that's taken to the extreme, and we want to see the victims as somehow greater than human, and we want to put them on a pedestal and romanticize them a little bit. And so I was a little concerned that, you know, my main, or all of my characters maybe, but my main character definitely wasn't romanticized. She's definitely a flawed character. So I think I was a little, you know, apprehensive about putting a character like that out there. But on the other hand, I personally am drawn to main characters who kind of have to grapple with, who we don't necessarily relate to right away.
Yeah, I really love.
If that answers your question.
It does, definitely. Well, I wonder, would you like to read a little excerpt maybe from the book?
Sure. Let's see. I'll just read a couple pages. This is from chapter 9, and the part 1 is called Conspiracy Theories, and this is chapter 9 of that part 1. That Saturday, after I met Mom at the warehouse, while your dad was at work, I woke from a nap to find our living room looking as though a hurricane had swept through. Couch pillows, my sewing things, newspapers, jackets, and books were strewn everywhere. A plant had tipped over, and the pot was now cracked, soil spilling onto the floor. I ran out of the apartment into the hall and thought about finding someone in the building to call the police. What if the intruder was still in the apartment? Our building, built sometime around the 1920s, had just 7 units, and most residents, like us, kept to themselves. But after standing outside the door a few minutes and not hearing anything from inside, I stuck my head through the doorway, called out a few times, and still hearing nothing, went back in. My purse sat open and rifled through on the kitchen table, but as far as I could see, nothing was missing. Even my laptop was sitting there on the coffee table, right where I'd left it before lying down for my nap on the couch. I went to the bedroom and found a similar scene. Our bedding, clothes, and books were scattered about willy-nilly, all drawers pulled open, even those on my jewelry chest and the file cabinet where we kept important papers, their contents scattered about. It looked as though someone had gone through our things, one item at a time, looking for something specific. I went to put everything back in its place, but just as I began, I stopped myself. The apartment was now a crime scene, I realized, and the police would want to investigate the evidence exactly as it was. My heartbeat quickened. I carefully backed out of the bedroom and returned to the living room to call the police, when I noticed something I'd missed at first. In contrast to the chaos, some of our things, pillows, a few books, a framed picture, a DVD, had been neatly arranged into a small tower in the center of the floor. I was unable to look away. This stack of ordinary things looked disconcertingly meaningful. Had Shiro been home? Could he have gotten off of work early and for some bizarre reason made this mess and built this tower? But why on earth would he do such things? Telling myself not to panic, that there was surely some logical explanation for all this, I went back to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling. I decided the idea of Shiro having done this made no sense. He was still at work. It must have been some unknown intruder with some specific agenda. After all, what kind of burglar takes the time to arrange random objects in such a way? The tower felt like a particularly perverted gesture, even personal, as though it had been built only to upset me. To make matters worse, that cat in the building was crying again, this time louder. I wondered if it wasn't stuck outside someone's door, but trapped inside some small, stifling space, crying to be let out. The voice was so pathetic, so nagging and grating, it felt as though the little creature were perched on my shoulder, crying directly into my ear. When Shiro got home, I was in the kitchen making dinner. I'd spent the afternoon cleaning. In the end, I decided against calling the police, since after all, nothing had been stolen. And the last thing I wanted was to think more about the disconcerting incident.
I love it. Yeah, so mysterious.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanna ask you about the towers a little bit, but I wanted to just mention that a review, one of the many reviews that your book has gotten, which is this one is from Salon.com, that has labeled the book one of the must-read books of the season. And they talk about the hints of Japanese mythology and the Shinto religion that wash the story with a fraught animism and magical realism. And the reviewer writes, with Block 17, Guthrie has recreated the fear of the other and created a hauntingly visceral experience that will linger on in the fringes of the amygdala. And I feel like that excerpt that you just read really kind of starts to bring out that feeling. But do you mind talking a little bit about Shinto symbolism and animism in the book?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I love that quote. Thanks for reading that quote. I think, for me, I've always loved the idea that everything, even inanimate objects, have kind of their own life force or their own energy. So I've kind of gravitated towards that belief in many cultures. And I think I've also been drawn to non-linear art forms, surrealism. That's part of why I love dance so much, poetry, and in writing, even in prose. I love to kind of enter a metaphorical world where, in a way, everything is alive, and to kind of play with that slippage in a way, I guess you could say, between the signifier and the signified, or to kind of be able to play with even the smallest, most inanimate object being a live part of the story. So I was enjoying playing with that. I love Haruki Murakami is one of my all-time favorite authors, and I'm definitely inspired by him in that way. I love when people write about trauma in a way that's a bit more dreamlike, because I think that's part of the nature of trauma, is that it can't in a way be told in a linear narrative. And then I also, when I started writing this story, I had a friend read it, and she suggested to me that I look to Japanese mythology. And it reminded me that once when I was visiting my kind of ancestral homeland in Japan and visiting my grandmother's childhood house, we took a walk up a mountain, and I saw all these statues, these Jizo statues, these small stone statues with the bright red bibs. That really struck me, and I didn't know much about them at the time. But I did more research, when I got home, and it occurred to me like that Jizo, the Jizo legend would fit in with the story that I was trying to tell, and in a way, for me, was a missing piece of the puzzle. So then I kind of went back to the beginning and started to integrate the legend of Jizo into the story, and that really helped me to kind of find something deeper in the story.
Yeah, beautiful. Beautiful. I think we're coming to the end of our time allotment here, but I was wondering if you had anything else that you wanted to say, or if maybe there are any new artistic seeds that you're thinking of planting for the future that you wanted to mention.
Well, first of all, I just want to again say thank you so much. It's so great to talk to you about this story. I feel like we've been artistic collaborators for so long. So I was really thankful that you agreed to having this conversation. And also want to say thank you to Mia and everyone at Tadaima for having us. I'm really honored to be on the program with Kiku Hughes and Traci Chee. As far as new projects, I do feel like I have these ideas swirling around in my head, but because of COVID right now, I'm lucky enough to be mostly on shelter in place with my family, but I have no privacy at all. I'm constantly with people, getting snacks, doing dishes. So I have this fantasy that someday I will be able to once again kind of sit with my ideas. But I do have some. So, one day soon, hopefully I'll be able to write a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you have plenty of things to do with all the book talks and getting the word out about the current book. So
yeah. I also want to say thank you to my publisher, Blackstone Publishing, and my agent, Amy Ashcraft, because they've been just so supportive. Again, during this time, it's a strange time to be publishing a novel, but I feel like, it's been a really wonderful experience.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Kimi, and thank you, Tadaima and Mia, Erin, everyone.
Thanks, Debbie.
I am so excited to be here today with Kiku Hughes, who is a comics artist from Seattle. She is the author of Displacement, her first graphic novel. And Displacement is, I have to tell you all, so wonderful. It is about a girl who also happens to be named Kiku, who magically, mysteriously gets transported back in time to 1942 and the Japanese American incarceration, where she finds herself in very close proximity to her grandmother, and she has no control over when she gets transported back in time, or displaced, as she calls it. And that causes all sorts of problems for her, even as she learns more and more about the incarceration and her own family history. And it is just wonderful. It comes out in a few days, and I'm so excited for you all to read it.
Thanks so much, Traci. And I am equally excited to introduce Traci Chee, who is a New York Times bestselling author for the Reader Trilogy fantasy series. And her upcoming novel, We Are Not Free, is a historical fiction novel that is just absolutely gorgeous. About a group of friends from San Francisco in the 1940s who are taken to Tan Fran and Topaz because they're Japanese American, and the sort of various ways in which they react to their situation, in which they fight for their own sense of community, of belonging, of friendship, of love. There's so many different stories and perspectives, and it's all so beautiful. And that comes out next month.
Thank you.
October? Sorry.
No, September 1st.
September,
yeah.
Yes, okay.
So I felt so lucky to be reading Displacement a little bit early, because it was such an interesting take on kind of the same events that are in We Are Not Free. Both of our characters kind of originate in San Francisco in the 1940s, and then are sent to the temporary detention center at Tan Fran, like Kiku said, and then on to Topaz. And so kind of, it feels like a little bit like they're the two sides of the same coin. And so a big difference is that Kiku's is a graphic novel. And if you could hold up that cover for us, mine is here. But yes, so Displacement is a graphic novel. So Kiku, I was super interested. I'd love to hear kind of what your background is as an artist and writer. Like, how did you come to be making this novel, this graphic novel?
You know, it seems so obvious because I was an English major in college, and I always really liked to draw, but it took me a long time to realize how to put those two together into a comic. But when I finally did, you know, I saw that comics were sort of where a lot of the best art was happening in terms of like visual arts, in my opinion. I felt like there was a really great community within comics that was coming together, especially with the internet. People were able to get their stuff out. People were able to self-publish. So it was really a community that was uplifting marginalized voices, which really drew me to comics as a medium in general. So yeah, that's sort of how I got into comics. Now you actually have, again, the best-selling series, the Reader Trilogy, which is a fantasy series. And I believe this is your first foray into sort of a historical fiction with We Are Not Free.
Yep.
So sort of what led you to, you know, make that jump from fantasy to historical fiction?
I super did not expect to make this jump. For the longest time, kind of everything that I wrote had magic in it. Like I could not keep the magic from creeping in no matter how hard I tried. And so the thing was, though, that I had been wanting to write a story about the incarceration for a really, really long time, because this is a period in history that really deeply affected my family. My grandparents were living on the West Coast in 1941 when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and they were forcibly evicted from their homes and sent to detention centers and later incarceration camps. And so it was kind of always there in the background, and I knew I wanted to tackle it somehow. I just for the longest time had no idea how. How could I possibly write about these experiences? And for a while I thought, I'll write it through the lens of historical fantasy. I'll have the magic creep in. The thing was that kind of the more research I did, the more books I read, the more museums I visited, the more relatives I interviewed about their experiences, the more I realized that there's just nothing I could invent that would be better and more true than the things that actually happen to people. And so I was like, well, goodbye magic for this one. The magic will be instead kind of this really rich history with all of these incredible details. And so that's how it became just like strictly historical. And I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of your personal connection to this history as well, because you are a yonsei, just like I am. And Displacement starts with this really cool scene of Kiku and her mom trying to track down this location of an old address in J-Town, San Francisco. And I was super drawn into it because I was like, I know this exact experience of like walking up and down these streets, like being like, did we miss it? We have to go back. And then same thing happened to me as happens to Kiku and her mom. They figure out that the house has been torn down, and in fact, it used to stand where the Japanese Peace Plaza now stands in J-Town. And so I found this really fascinating because it felt like you were making literal this gap between kind of the experiences of us yonsei, who kind of we take for granted like the facts about our grandparents. So they were born at this time, they lived here, they worked here, but we don't somehow like kind of connect that to the stories and their actual lived experiences. For me, for example, I didn't even know about the incarceration until I was 12. My grandfather was receiving an honorary diploma from the San Francisco Unified School District because they were giving these honorary diplomas out to people who would have graduated from their schools if not for the incarceration. And I was at the ceremony. I don't super remember it. What I do remember is that my grandpa was interviewed in the San Francisco Chronicle, and he was quoted as saying, Where were the bleeding hearts in 1942?
Wow.
And like that was my first introduction to it. That anger, that bitterness, like years, decades later. And so that is something that really stuck with me as I kind of embarked on this journey. So can you talk more about your personal connection, the origin of this scene with Kiku and her mom, anything that you'd like to tell us about your link to this past?
Yeah, so that scene specifically with trying to track down my grandmother's original address in San Francisco, only to find out it was the Peace Plaza now. It's based on a true story. It didn't happen in 2016 like in the book, but it is something that that happened when my mom and I were visiting San Francisco for the first time. And I did feel like it was a good place to start because, yeah, it sort of was a metaphor for, you know, trying to track down history as we, you know, Yonsei, but anyone who is, you know, from a later generation is trying to do, and finding that, you know, the actual history itself, you can't necessarily get to it. You can't access it in its most authentic, like, state. And I also felt like the fact that it was replaced by a mall, even though it is Nihon Machi, it does kind of parallel, I feel like, the experience of being Japanese American, like something, you know, historic, connections to community being torn down, being sort of pulled apart, and then kind of replaced, but in a much more commercial, like, package, I guess. And I feel like, yeah, I don't know, it felt like kind of a good entryway into sort of this idea of chasing down history. But yeah, so my grandmother was born in San Francisco in the 20s and was taken to Tanforan and Topaz when she was 16 years old. And she actually died long before I was born. So I didn't have any relatives to talk to about sort of their experiences. And you know, she died in the 70s when it was still, you know, Nisei and Issei were still not necessarily sharing their experiences. So yeah, I feel like a big part of the book is me sort of trying to chase down this history, this like concrete history that I can't ever actually access. Yeah. Yeah, and so yeah, so you talk about in your author's note, especially the ways in which you sort of weave your family history into the, you know, fictionalized versions of that, into the characters in We Are Not Free. Specifically, I'm thinking you mentioned the character Betty. Is it Betty or is it Bet? I get that.
I say Betty, but so many people say Bet. Okay. I guess I can say it's Betty. There we go.
Betty. Betty, who wears a blonde wig, which I thought was such a great little detail, and I loved Betty's character, like just the ways and her little affectations were fantastic, but also giving a look into sort of the ways in which Western beauty standards affect people of color. Anyway, you talk about her blonde wig being inspired by your grandmother's blonde wig. And I thought that was such a great little detail. And I wanted to know, because as I said, I wasn't able to ask my relatives about camp. What was the process of talking to your relatives about their experience in camp like for you? And how does that relationship change over time? Did you find it easier to talk to them now than you would have, say, like 10 years ago? Yeah, and sort of how did they feel about having their stories sort of put out there?
Yeah, okay, so there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
First, I wanted to say, I thought your observation about like J-Town in general and kind of like the Peace Plaza was really interesting because I grew up there. And so like the Peace Plaza and the mall and kind of that little street with the fountain, those are so much a part of my idea of what it means to be Japanese American. Like it like, you know what I mean? And like kind of that combination and like this idea of a Peace Plaza, of like a place of history and coming out of this harrowing experience in World War II is just, to me, always felt really beautiful at the same time as kind of having, oh, well, there's a mall there. And like the mall is like a very American thing in my mind, you know what I mean? And so like, yeah, absolutely. And with my relatives, I was fortunate that quite a few of them were willing to talk to me. My grandparents, who lived in San Francisco, had unfortunately passed away by that time, but I was able to interview great aunts, great uncles, my step grandma, and it was incredible kind of getting to hear them talk about what it was like being, 13, 16 years old, and sent into an incarceration camp. And they were so generous in sharing their stories with me. And if I asked a question, they'd give me like an overview of what, kind of their daily life was like. And then they'd hone in on like specific moments, like the one with the wig. That I was able to be like, you know what, this is such a good like nugget of truth that has to go into this book. And then I felt so grateful and so honored that they would entrust me with their stories and put their faith in my ability to turn them into fiction. And so once we found out that We Are Not Free was going to be published, I contacted them all and I was like, well, here we go. I hope it's okay with you still that I'm fictionalizing some of your accounts. And then once we had advanced reading copies, I sent everyone that I interviewed or got a source from, I sent them an early copy and I was like, here's what I did with your stories. If there's anything that you really object to being out there in public, please let me know. I have transformed your experiences into fiction, so people in general won't be able to be like, that's your grandma, or like, that's your great auntie. And as far as I know, they have been really happy with how it turned out. I've gotten some thank you cards and talked to them on the phone about it, and they have been so supportive. And it's really wonderful to be able to have that privilege and also that responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a gorgeous book. I'm sure they were thrilled with how it turned out, and yeah. That sort of brings me to the idea of, not having a direct resource myself. There were some things that I felt like, again, I just couldn't access. There's some information that I just knew I wouldn't be able to get, which is, always the problem with historical writing. There's always going to be some gaps in your knowledge and some areas that you just can't dive as deeply into as you wish you could. Did you have any specific areas of research that you weren't 100% sure about including, or if there were any, like, what is the role of historical accuracy, I guess, in telling these sorts of stories? Like, how worried were you about getting things 100% correct?
I was very worried because I am a good Asian student. And so, yeah, that was like always on my mind of how can I be as true as possible to this history and still kind of weave my story through it. And so wherever possible, I use actual things that happened and the actual dates of them happening. I did kind of stray away from including actual historical figures as like walking, talking characters in the book, because that's a little funny. But yeah, and so where I couldn't find a source, I would either kind of dance around it or, just kind of fudge a little, be a little bit more general about it. There's a scene where they are making takuan in Tule Lake. And I don't know exactly if they made takuan in Tule Lake. I would imagine so. I know they had access to daikon, right? But making takuan is such a big part of my family. We always have some in the fridge. And so I was like, you know what? Probably if they could store food, pickle food, because there were food shortages at Tule Lake at the time, then they probably would try and take advantage of that. So it just, best guess. And I had, a similar question for you about kind of combining fiction and history, because for me it was a big challenge to kind of figure out, all right, we have to talk about the eviction, and we have to talk about Tanforan, and we have to talk about the conditions at Topaz when they arrived in late 1942. And so I'm wondering, like, how you chose which events to talk about, how you chose kind of what things to hit as you were creating the story of Kiku the character going through the past.
Yeah, because so much of what I was writing about really focused on like the lasting legacy of camp and of intergenerational trauma and things like the ways that community memory affects us. I really started from like a springboard of all the things that I was told, stories that were passed on to me from my mom, and I sort of picked those like main sort of events and subjects that I knew like from my whole life, and thought those must be the most lasting, the most important moments. So, for example, the things that I remember most like hearing about from my mom were like, it was very dusty. That was a big one. The No-No boys were definitely something that I learned about, though not completely. Like I knew the concept, I didn't know all the details. The scene with the Quakers bringing my grandmother a present, that was also a big moment that I remember hearing about. And as well as the murder of James Wakasa was another one that I think was left a lasting impact, so much so that I heard about it, secondhand, and knew about it, basically as long as I can remember. So there were these big landmark moments and details that I feel like were passed down because they were important, or they represented something important in our collective memory. And so from there, I just wanted to expand and sort of look into the facts as much as you can have facts, the differing viewpoints, the differing like experiences, and sort of fill in the gaps that I had around these big moments. Yeah.
That's cool. No, I love that. It reminds me of, there's a scene kind of in the middle of We Are Not Free where one of my characters is able to go into town, and she gets shouted out of an ice cream store. The owner shouts ethnic slurs at her, and she has to leave. And that is one of those big moments that got passed down through my family. It happened to my great uncle. He was much younger, but yeah, absolutely. Those are the kind of things that resonate. Cool.
I think I was just also going to ask sort of about big moments like the Tule Lake riots, as the government would have called them. And moments like I noticed, like you had an analog for the murder of James Wakasa in your book as well. There's like huge moments. Sort of, how did you deal with tackling them, and sort of the difficulty of expressing these really like heated, sort of some maybe controversial moments in camp history?
Yeah, I think you have kind of pulled out the heart of it, is that things like the events that happened at Tule Lake when it was under martial law, and like maybe a month before, right, as the so-called no-nos were moved into Tule Lake, and then the strikes that happened and the protests, and then the martial law, and then also kind of the murder of James Wakasa in Topaz in April 1943. These are events that I don't think we now in the 21st century have a good read on exactly the facts about what happened. And so as a researcher and a writer, I had to kind of try and find the truth of it through all of these other sources that may or may not have been reliable, or absolutely were biased in one direction or another. And so For example, regarding the murder of James Wakasa, the newspaper, the Topaz Times, which was written and produced by the incarcerees, but was definitely approved by the white administration, who was working for the War Relocation Authority and the federal government, right? They had one version of that story printed where Mr. Wakasa was walking towards the fence, and the guard thought he was trying to escape and shouted a warning and like tried to fire a warning shot, and then accidentally killed him. And then there are other accounts, right, from that same event where Mr. Wakasa was hard of hearing, and so maybe he didn't hear a warning, shouted from hundreds of feet away, right? Or was maybe he did hear it and was turning back away from the fence when he was shot, because that's kind of a report of how his body was positioned when it was found. And there's so many things like that where the truth is a little out of our reach. And so we have to do, I think, our best to kind of winnow down and be like, okay, what could be the truth in all of these conflicting reports? For example, coming out of Tule Lake, I read a number of government documents from that time, like describing like the riots and how the incarcerees were vandalizing property, right? And so maybe, but also kind of trying to think about like what might have been the other side of that, right? If they were vandalizing property, even if that was happening, is that really the destruction of property? Is that what we should take away from this event where they had, unsafe working conditions and food shortages, right? And they were treated so unjustly overall. So and people were kind of being picked up and harassed, right? So how can we just condemn the vandalism portion of it and not look at these other pieces of it, of the military coming in and the military police taking people off the streets, right? And so these are questions that I absolutely wrestled with and tried to figure out, like, all right, what would a teenager be seeing at this time? What would a 16-year-old, a 17-year-old be experiencing while all of this is going around them? So yeah, I mean, I did my best to kind of get at the truth of the history and also speak to this 21st century audience, because we have a different perspective on it than the people who lived it, I am sure.
Yeah. And I feel like having so many different narrators and having so many different perspectives really helps with that, because you get so many different eyes and different feelings about events.
Yeah, that actually, if we can skip ahead on our questions. Yeah, I did want to talk a little bit about the characters and also some research, because I noticed that in your book you have Kiku, the main character, and another girl, May, fall in love in camp. And I was so thrilled to see this. I think it's so important to be conscious and intentional about who gets included and who gets erased from history, whose stories are told and whose stories are remembered, and the power kind of inherent in which groups get represented when we talk about history and historical fiction. I did find it really hard to locate sources on what it was like for LGBT plus people in the camps. I mean, the most I could find were a handful of articles on Jiro Onuma, who was a gay man from San Francisco, who was later incarcerated in Tanforan and Topaz. And he's also featured at the GLBT Historical Society Museum in San Francisco. So if anyone's in San Francisco, I highly recommend checking that out. So I'd love to hear more about kind of your research for Kiku and May's relationship and your creative process in bringing them onto the page.
Yeah, thank you. Well, yeah, like you said, Jiro Onuma is kind of the best documented, LGBT person from camp. Basically, one of the only people who left documented life behind. I mean, you have George Nikkei, of course, but he's, a child. So, that decision actually was really more personal than rooted in research. I am gay, and I know, therefore, that gay people have always existed in every context. And in a camp with 120,000 plus people, there were definitely LGBT people living in camp. And I was really grateful to my editors to allow me to just keep that little nod in there. Basically, that not a lot of research, but a lot of feeling of this is we exist. So
yes, absolutely. And I think it's so important to see that LGBT history isn't, just the past few decades. Like, it goes back and back and back and back and back. So I was so excited to see that in there.
Sort of on the topic of characters, and I don't want to spoil anything, but you have so many different characters in We Are Not Free, so many different various perspectives. And I wanted to, I felt like that was such a great way to tell the very different backgrounds of everybody incarcerated. It wasn't just like a monolith of Japanese Americans. It was so many various, backgrounds, various people. And I really enjoyed that in We Are Not Free. So sort of what was the process of figuring out that you wanted to include, so many different narrators? And if I can also piggyback on that question and ask, who was the easiest for you to write? Like, who did you relate to most? And which character did you feel was the most difficult to write for?
So if I could have written this any other way, I would have, because 14 main characters was difficult to write. But the thing was, as I was thinking of what it would look like if I wrote a story about the incarceration, I could not narrow in on one story. There were so many to tell. There were so many kind of different reactions and different facets and nuances of what it was like in the camps, and what teenagers were experiencing at the time. And so I just didn't choose one. I was like, why should I have to? We are not a monolith. And I don't know about you, but for me, when I was growing up, I kind of had this prevailing story about the incarceration, and it was kind of one of what I call noble Japanese suffering, right? And this is what I was told that my family did, and people were obedient and compliant, right? And I believe firmly that some people did that. Some people, that was their experience. But I think back to Chimamanda Adichie's Danger of a Single Story TED Talk, right? And how it is dangerous to just say there's one experience. There's only one type of Japanese American incarceration experience, or there's only one type of person who is in the camps, because it erases so many others, right? All of these nuances that I, and I think you too, discovered while we were researching. There were so many different types of people, and they had so many different reasons for acting or not acting right the way that they did. And so I was like, well, I'm going to write 14 of those, and just hope that more and more people come up with more and more ways to talk about kind of all of the different kind of crystal structures of this experience, and all of these different kind of beautiful or harrowing or angering or joyful moments, because they all happened. And I think they're all important to remember. When it comes to characters that were easy or difficult, I actually, the easiest ones were the ones who were, in general, very unlike me. Twitchy, who is I say that he is not the brightest tool the sharpest tool in the shed, but he sure is the shiniest. He's so dumb, but he's so fun, and he has such a big heart, and he moves so fast. He's always on his feet, and I'm always in my head. And yet he was so easy to write. His chapter, which is following the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in their campaigns in Europe in the summer and fall of 1944, though they just flowed right out of me. And I was like, well, there's Twitchy's chapter. Okay, next one. But at the same time, the characters who were most difficult to write were also the ones who were most unlike me. So I'm thinking of the character of Stan, who is kind of our window into the loyalty questionnaire. And he is smart and he knows it, which I guess is kind of like me. But he's got this very sarcastic, wry sense of humor, and that is not me. I don't know if you can tell, probably because I wear all of my reactions and my emotions is like right there on my face. I am so earnest and so sincere, and that is not Stan. Stan has that aloofness that was really, really difficult to write. And that brings me to some of your characters. I would love to talk about Aiko, who is wonderful. She's someone who Kiku meets when they are in Tanforan. She's critical, intelligent, savvy. She does not hold back on her ideas about injustice, oppression, resistance, and she's like, it's like she opens up Kiku's ideas about what the incarceration was and who was in it and what they did. So I'm wondering kind of what went into the creation of Aiko, and then also why did you want to feature a character like her in 2020, or for young people in 2020?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because I think Stan and Aiko share a lot of sensibilities. I think they would get along pretty well. Aiko definitely represented sort of this leftist, outspoken side of Nisei that I didn't really grow up hearing about. And I was very excited to read about this sort of more vocal resistance to incarceration, to mistreatment within camps. Like, again, I similar to you, I grew up sort of hearing about sort of Japanese Americans, doing their part and being loyal and being, noble in the face of suffering, etc. And it was, very inspiring for me to see the various ways in which people resisted within camp. And so Aiko was sort of that to me, that envoy into, she represented that element that I didn't grow up reading about very often. And I think also she represented the way that I wish that I could act in that situation. Like, I think she was sort of my personal hero in that situation, the person that I wish the bravery and the moral fiber and everything that I wish, that I hope to have, in the world. So I'm hoping that is sort of what she represents in a 2020 context also, like the ways that you can stand up, the ways that you can speak out, even when situations are against you. Yeah. So I think we only have probably a few minutes left. And I know we have so much more that we wanted to talk about. But I think maybe for the last few minutes, I was going to ask sort of what. Okay, sorry. I would like to ask sort of about the relationship between We Are Not Free and current events. Like, one thing that I noticed especially was the scene in Tule Lake when the military police deploy gas and are yelling at everybody to disperse, to get back in their homes, that this martial law situation that's happening. And the scene that you write about reflects the current Black Lives Matter protests, especially in Portland, when military police again were gassing people and telling them to disperse. It felt exactly parallel to protests happening right now. And I'm wondering if there are other instances, or if there are moments in the book that feel different now or feel relevant now than they did when you were writing, or how your relationship has changed with the book since when you first started writing it.
Yeah, I've got, thank you for asking this question. I've got kind of 3 moments of reflection and change as I was writing this, and then now I'm promoting it. The first was, I interviewed my great aunt in 2016, in the summer of 2016. So it was before the election, and then also before 2017, when we really started hearing about family separation in ICE detention centers and at the border. And so in this interview, my Auntie Mary talks to me about these 2 girls in J-Town. Their parents were Japanese teachers, and they were taken kind of the day after Pearl Harbor by the FBI, and these girls were left alone, right? This family was separated. And so in 2017, as I was starting to draft this, that was so on my mind. And I was listening to this interview from 2016, from like 9 months before, and it hit me that family separation is not new in this country, right? This was one small instance among many in the 1940s, but it happened. And that was kind of my Auntie Mary's reaction. I was listening to her say this, and she was like, how could they do that? But they did, right? And that was so similar to my reaction in 2017 as my awareness of family separation was growing. And so I wrote it into the book. I was like, this is still relevant. Like, this has to go in. And then as I was getting further on in the writing of it, and my characters were experiencing martial law at Tule Lake, and I was reading about, the military police riding down the streets in their military armored trucks with their huge guns, right? And their gas. I was absolutely thinking about Ferguson, right? Which had happened so many years before, but it was still, those Black Lives Matter protests are still ongoing, right? Military or state violence against American citizens is still happening on our streets. And so I was like, I have to write with this in mind, that this history is not gone, that we are still doing it. And this history also stretches way back through our history, right? And then you brought up, actually, in a previous conversation with me, that Stan gets sick while he is in the Tule Lake stockade because they are crammed into a barrack like sardines, right? And those are the conditions where illness can spread. And yeah, as I'm hearing now about COVID-19 spreading in ICE detention centers and prisons, right? It is still happening, right? We are still subjecting people to these unsafe, unsanitary, inhumane conditions. It is not over. It is still happening. And so this brings me to a question that I had for you, which was kind of about I'm sorry. It was about kind of how you tackle in a much more direct way, because you have the benefit of Kiku, a 21st century American character, going back in time and able to comment directly on kind of the parallels between now and then. So I was wondering about what kind of power you think this kind of hindsight affords us, and also, can you point us to some Japanese American organizations working towards social justice that we can all check out right now?
Yeah, so definitely I used the method of time travel, or sort of memory travel, as my character discovers, as a way to sort of, have a 21st century perspective on the parallels between then and now, also as a way for me to excuse any gaps in my knowledge. But I felt like I started writing displacement in 2016, after basically right after the election is when I really started sort of actually physically writing the book. And I do think, I included a lot of snippets from the Trump campaign and from the election, from the early days, as much as I could. I was basically rewriting things as things were happening, but from the early days of the Muslim ban and the family separations. And I sort of felt like it was important to include that, not only because of the parallels, but I do think it becomes a part of Japanese American history because of organizations that have come together as the Japanese American organizations to protest specifically family separation, to protest inhumane treatment in migrant detention centers, basically further incarceration camps. Organizations such as Suri for Solidarity, which is a group that is working in conjunction with a lot of other immigration rights groups like La Resistencia, to close concentration camps in the United States. That's a big one that I highly recommend checking out. Yeah.
Well,
I think that is it. Yeah, I think that's
yeah,
all.
I know. We are out of time. We have so much more to talk about, but my last question is, when does Displacement come out? When can we get it, and where can we get our hands on it?
Displacement comes out on August 18th, so just 4 days from now. You can get it basically wherever books are sold, but I will say that I would recommend not using Amazon, because Amazon does provide aid to ICE and therefore props up existing concentration camps in the United States. So anywhere but Amazon. And where can we get We Are Not Free, and when does it come out?
We Are Not Free comes out on September 1st, so about 2 weeks from now. And like with Displacement, you can get it wherever books are sold. Although I would highly recommend finding a local independent bookseller to you. You can find them on IndieBound if you type in your zip code, and they'll point you right to them. Or you could support a San Francisco bookstore, Books Inc., which is offering some special goodies for pre-orders of We Are Not Free. So those are 2 places. And Kiku, it was so wonderful talking to you. I am so excited about the Q&A section too.
Me too. I know. I wish that we had way more time, but it was so great talking to you. It was incredible being able to read We Are Not Free. Highly cannot talk about how great it is enough. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see your faces. Thanks, everyone, for hanging out. And thank you also to Debbie, who moderated the conversation with Kimmy. I so enjoyed seeing your discussions. Hold on, I'm going to try to get this glare out of the way. Maybe I'll just sit really close to the camera. But I really enjoyed hearing your conversations with each other. But I also just want to gush for a moment. I called it my homework, but I finished Displacement this morning. I finished Block 17 this morning. I read the chapter preview of We Are Not Free the other day. And I think everyone who is watching right now needs to come back and rewatch it after you've gotten your hands on their works and had a chance to read them all. Please make sure and pre-order and get your hands on all of these great pieces, because I think they all complement each other really well. So I hope we'll be able to get into that a little bit in the conversation. I thought everything was a little bit, different format and different perspectives, but there's a lot of common threads I want to unpack. Kimmy, Block 17 was kind of like a psychological thriller, but I thought it was a really good venue to sort of explore the themes of intergenerational trauma, which I want to ask all of you about. And then Kiku, yours was different from the perspective of somebody who's from the present day, obviously time traveling back to camps. But I thought that it was really powerful in very few words in a lot of places, and really interesting asking how we can arm ourselves with knowledge, right? Because there were so many times where they didn't have the whole picture, even knowing about it in the present day, to be able to confront issues in the past. And then Traci, I thought your work, the digital chapter previews that I was able to read, were so visceral. And I think that it might be my first time ever reading anything fictional from the perspective of a young Nisei male. The couple of chapters from Shig and the other brother. So it was so cool, and I can't wait to dig into the rest of We Are Not Free. But I wanted to start out and just asking all of you, a little bit of a heavy hitter to start with, but how intergenerational trauma sort of tied into your work, both in your experience writing it, or maybe your inspiration for writing, but also in your characters themselves. So if anyone would want to jump in and tackle that.
I can start, I guess. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think for me, when I wanted to write this story, I kept almost having these like blank spots. I would try to access the story that I wanted to tell. And my one of the main kind of qualities that kept coming up for me was absence, like a sense of erasure. And I remember talking to my husband about this, like, I want to write this story, but I just don't know how to, because there's so much kind of inarticulateness in my mind about it. And he was like, well, write about that. And that seemed great, but it was also difficult in a way to write about absence. But I think, and I was really, I love the conversation just now between you two, Kiku and Traci, and I was struck by our kind of shared experience. And I think it's one that many people can relate to, where there's trauma, trauma like takes us out of our body, and there's oppression, there's repression, and it just kind of fragments our identity and experience. And of course, there was erasure, actually concrete, physical erasure, loss of property, men being taken away, by the FBI even before the incarceration, loss of language and identity. So I think for me, it was that sense of trying to get at that the quality of absence that kind of haunted me.
Yeah, I have a very similar experience. And I do think, like, hearing your chat, Kimmy, there were a lot of things that I really felt very connected to in that way. This idea of like trying to access a history that's so obscured. And for displacement, I think one of the main ways I tried to tackle the idea of sort of intergenerational trauma is the displacements themselves become like a physical expression of this trauma, reliving sort of a past that you can't escape. There's like an element of being forced to experience something that you have no control over. And there's also elements of, there's a moment in displacement where Kiku is listening to her neighbors speak in Japanese and she doesn't understand what they're saying. And it sort of occurred to me as I was researching and thinking about family history, like the very conscious choice that my grandmother made not to teach her children Japanese, and the ways in which, this intergenerational trauma can cause one generation to, protect their children by making these decisions, like not teaching them the language, that then later, has a ripple effect on later generations who are trying to connect. So that's just one sort of example.
Yeah, I think in We Are Not Free, I was really kind of tackling the idea of like a group of people who are fractured and then scattered because of the incarceration. And that happens to this very tight-knit friend group from San Francisco. But I also feel like that is just, it's like a microcosm of what happened to so many Japanese American communities along the West Coast, like in J-Town or in Little Tokyo, right? We had vibrant, full, wonderful, like communities that I feel like maybe the federal government kind of took a hammer to, right? And then forced people to go into detention centers and then incarceration camps thousands of miles from anything that was familiar to these people. And then also there was that additional pressure of assimilation on top of it, like the pressure to relocate and just kind of like blend in to these cities in the Midwest and the East Coast. And I feel like that additional pressure of like be more American, by which we mean be more white, really meant that we lost so many things along the way. And I think that's something that I think people like us are trying to kind of gather up now from the pieces that we can find.
Yeah, I think you all showed a lot of different glimpses into pre-war community and the beautiful relationships that existed there and the Japan towns that existed. And then that really visceral feeling of loss, I think, was evident in all three of your works. And then I think through what you all do in reclaiming that history is also part of all the stories too, with your characters trying to learn more and understand more. So I just really enjoyed them. But I want to ask now an audience question, which I think, looking at this could have been a Hapa Yonsei panel. We could definitely go into this rabbit hole. But I want to ask this question from Kathy. She asks, how does your mixed race identity factor into your work? from a mixed race Japanese and white fan living in San Francisco, Japantown.
I could start, I guess. Also mixed race Japanese and white. I think one of the things that early on I thought, when thinking about camp, I was looking into it and reading about the 1/32nd rule, that anyone with, more than 1/32nd percentage, that's not a percentage, fraction of Japanese ancestry had to go to camp, which was anybody with any amount of Japanese ancestry, because there were only so many generations in the United States at the time. And thinking sort of as I was trying to write my character's experience, realizing like I'm pretty white passing in the world, and yet would still have had to go to camp, which is kind of a bizarre feeling. Yeah, and I think that was it's something I didn't have a lot of resources to explore in the book, because there's just not a lot of information that I could find about mixed race experiences in camp. But I do think being mixed and sort of thinking about your role in Japanese American history is sort of, it's interesting in that way when you experience the world now, not necessarily feeling Japanese, but then the government considered you to be Japanese enough to be a threat. It's like, it really brings it even more into sort of stark relief how ludicrous the whole thing is. But anyway.
Yeah, I'll speak to that too. I'm also half Japanese, half white. And I'm Sansei, I'm old. I'm the oldest one here. So yeah, I grew up in Berkeley. I think relatively speaking, it was a fairly diverse environment to grow up in. It's funny because I remember once my mom talking to some of her friends saying, yeah, all of Kimi's friends are Hapa. I know Hapa is a kind of problematic term now, but that was in the 70s. That's what we all identified as. And I remember thinking, no, that's not true. And then kind of looking around and saying, oh, wow, my best friends are like the only other two mixed Japanese white people in the whole school. I didn't realize that I was gravitating towards them for that reason, but there was obviously something there that bonded us. And I think in my novel, looking at kind of split identity and looking at navigating between two or more than two cultures was really interesting to me. In many ways, both just kind of looking at how those two cultures can be, I feel blessed to come from more than one culture, as many of us do. And I think more and more we're all like that. We get to experience multiple cultures, but also just looking at the confusion of those two identities, especially when they're in conflict with one another, as was the case during the incarceration. But also I was interested in looking at kind of between two worlds in other ways, between past and present, between kind of death and birth. In my story, I'm looking at the legend of Jizo, which in Buddhism, there's this god Jizo that helps with transitions between life and then death and then the next life. So there's this kind of limbo land in between. And to me, that was a really interesting, enticing metaphor for kind of being between two identities, two worlds. Yeah.
Should I go? I don't know. I don't consider myself biracial, I guess. I get, because I'm Asian. I'm Chinese American and I'm Japanese American, and I have felt since I was very young that I am very, very much kind of each one individually. I am Chinese American and I am Japanese American and I am Chinese and Japanese American. And so one of the things that actually helped me with this was reading books about kind of Chinese and Japanese American kids when I was younger. And so I want to shout out to Betty Ballard, who wrote The Year of the Boar, and Jackie Robinson, which was like super formative for me. It's about a little Chinese American girl like grappling with her identity as a Chinese American girl. And then also Yoshiko Uchida, who wrote The Best Bad Thing. And like there are a couple of books that come after that, and it's about a young Japanese American girl grappling with what it means to be Japanese American. And so like having literature about people like me when I was very young was so helpful. And so, like, for better or for worse now, I guess, I consider myself both, separately and together.
I love that. And I would love to hear more about, any Japanese American works that inspired you. I haven't been able to read a ton of fiction about camp, so this was really a good deep dive for me. And I've really enjoyed it because it really has the ability to transport you into that perspective at that time, processing things as the characters are. And so I want to ask if you all had any, pieces that you really looked up to or authors that you really looked up to within Japanese American literature.
I can say that, like, some of the research I did for We Are Not Free included Journey to Topaz by Yoshiko Uchida, Citizen 13660, which isn't fiction, right? But it's like that kind of eyewitness perspective, because Minya Okubo, who wrote that book, was actually there. Farewell to Manzanar was one of those. I also read No No Boy by John Okada. I'm pretty sure it's John Okada. And, like, that was fiction. It was one of the first fictionalized accounts about camp that came out. And so, and that perspective was very adult and very kind of obsessive and grim. And so, like, having that perspective too, kind of like these different kind of pieces all whirling around was, oh, sorry, my doggies, was really, really helpful for me in conceptualizing, like, it's not just one thing. And then also, I want to shout out to my old professor from UC Santa Cruz, Karen Yamashita, wrote a book that I can think of as soon as someone else goes.
Yeah, let us know.
I'll go. Because I also want to shout out Mina Kubo, Citizen 13660, which was a huge help for me when I was researching for displacement, especially as a visual, like, it was a visual storytelling that she was using, similar to comics, although it was more illustrated journal entries. And I was just so inspired by her work, especially because, photography was so limited, especially in the early days of camp. It was very inspiring to see the way that she used art to create the visuals that people were being deprived of by not being able to take pictures. And it showed sort of the power of art as a medium, not just to make beautiful pictures, but also to, record events and, create an authentic truth that otherwise might not be recorded. So she was very
Letters to Memory.
Letters to Memory by Karen
Yamashita wrote Letters to Memory, and it's partially kind of her digging back into her own family history and talking about that. Really good, highly recommend it.
Great.
I echo all of what you've been saying. I did a lot of nonfiction reading, as well as some fiction. I love Julia Otsuka's When the Emperor Was Divine. Am I getting that one right? Yeah. I love her voice. That one, it also takes place where I grew up, so that was really kind of felt especially resonant with me. I really loved Hotel on the Corner, Bitter and Sweet. Is that the title? I'm checking for it, I think. I think wasn't he even part of a talk through Tadaima? I missed that.
Yeah.
Farewell to Manzanar, as you mentioned. I actually have a connection with Jeannie Watsky Houston. I went to UC Santa Cruz too and studied with her husband, and my aunt actually knew her in high school a bit. I was also very influenced by some, it's not Japanese American, but A Pale View of Hills is a novel by Kazuo Ishiguro that is him talking about the war and kind of inherited trauma from Japan, and that was a novel that really influenced me too.
Well, you guys aren't going to believe this, but we have 2 minutes left.
Oh no.
This is completely flown. But I just want to please encourage everyone to read this, and how about you tell us where to find you guys? So if we have any questions, we want to be in dialogue with you, if you're open to it, where we can contact you. And then maybe we can sneak in another question there as well.
You can find me at tracichee.com, and that has all of my kind of social media links down at the bottom. So just my name, Traci Chee. There it is. There it is. .com.
Same. I have kimikoguthrie.com, although I have to say I've been a little negligent in updating my website. I'm trying to do that more, but I'm also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram a bit.
Yeah, I don't have a website right now because I'm very bad at this, but I'm on Twitter at Kiku Hughes, just my name. And my email address is there, so.
And Kiku and Traci, since your works are both coming out very soon, Kiku, I think you're next Tuesday.
Yeah, the 18th.
Yours is September 1st. So do you have any like events or anything you want to plug?
I will be having a book launch event on the 19th through Third Place Books, which is a local bookstore here in the Seattle area that is very good. So there should be a link, I think, somewhere in this chat area to sign up for that if it's a virtual event. And if you pre-order the book through Third Place, you have a chance to get a custom an illustration, a bonus illustration.
Wow.
Yeah, and I am also doing a virtual launch party. It is on September 1st, which is a Tuesday evening at 6 p.m. Pacific time. I'm doing it in conversation with another Bay Area Japanese-American author, Misa Sugiura. And also, it's hosted by the Japanese Cultural and Community Center of Northern California, the JCCC&C, and they are kind of a J-Town pillar. My grandpa used to like cook in their kitchens for the community, which is really cool. And also local bookseller Books Inc., which is where I recommend pre-ordering We Are Not Free if you are able. And I am planning on having, in addition to conversations with Misa, having trivia games, a special surprise guest, and then also some live readings, not by me, by actual people who do acting and reading for a living. So it should be really fun.
Cool.
Oh, that reminds me, sorry, I should shout out Densho, which is also helping out the event for the book release at Third Place. Densho is helping out, and they're such a great organization. So also thank you to Densho.
Yes, I've loved all of the shout outs to orgs in this chat. And I've just really, go ahead.
Oh, I'll just say that Revolution Books in Berkeley is also going to be hosting an event that I'll be part of, and I think Traci might be part of as well.
Yeah, we're putting that together. Yep.
Yeah, Revolution Books is a great bookstore in Berkeley.
Awesome. No, I've just had such a fun time hanging out with you three as we've prepared for this event. So I would love to see these conversations continue. Let's sneak in a couple more questions here. I wanted to ask a question from Redmond, and this is for, I think this is for you, Kimmy, but I think I could also send it to Kiku to speak to. Can you talk without spoilers a little bit about the mother and daughter relationship between the characters?
Shall I start? Okay. Sumiko and the daughter goes by Jane, but her given name is Akiko. I don't want to give spoilers, but Sumiko was incarcerated at the Rower camp as a child and underwent trauma there. So, in a way, her whole life after that has been her kind of reconciling with that. And in her case, she has her way of coping has been to deny the trauma, to kind of repress it, and to become almost militantly cheerful and to really not want to look at kind of the truth or the trauma. So her daughter, ironically, in her love for her daughter, her daughter being kind of the most important thing for her, she wants to hide and protect her daughter from what happened. And ironically, that causes Jane / Akiko lots of suffering because she's haunted in ways that she can't understand. So I guess in a way, there's some typical mother-daughter experiences, and then it's brought to an extreme in the story. And what I was talking about, my theme of kind of absence and disappearance, Sumiko, the mother character, is very much embodies that. She can't find her in real life. She's only online. So she's kind of disappeared into the virtual world to a certain degree.
Yeah, I think mine would also spoil a bit if I talk too much about it, and maybe we should just go on to the next question because Kimiko's answer was so good.
Okay, how about Ken Mochizuki's question, another great Japanese American author. Is there a pattern or trend that's developed in the camp stories over the generations, going from the Nisei authors to the Yonsei and beyond, like yourselves? So we kind of mentioned all of those seminal works. Do you think there's any trends like over the years that you've seen?
Tracy, if you...
Yeah, I think the trend, oh gosh, I don't know if I can speak to this, but it seems like there's a wanting of more, just like more stories, more than the ones that we were kind of always told growing up, more than just the stories about gaman or shikataganai, right? More perspectives about like these little pockets of history that maybe we didn't hear about, but certainly existed. And so that's been my experience in writing, kind of trying to write my way into this canon of Japanese American literature, to just have more depth and then also more breadth.
Yeah, I think as time goes on and hopefully we, only get closer and closer to actually, validating the rights of every human being, I think there is definitely more demand for stories like, for instance, for LGBT stories within camp, which have been so, denied and hushed over. I think that is one. And I think there is also, with the perspective of time, and the sort of distance between Yonsei and Issei, like this feeling of not having that direct connection, I think does change the tone of stories that come later.
Sorry, I muted myself. I think I would echo, I think you both answered that beautifully, so I can't add too much, but I think I would just echo that. And I know for me, as I mentioned in my interview with Debby, I really wanted to write from my current day perspective to really kind of look at, because my experience obviously isn't having been there, but having that quality of trying to kind of weave together my identity with these fragments. And so kind of looking at that fragmented inheritance, I guess. And I think also what you spoke to about the gaman and the sense of the noble, I also spoke about this a bit in my interview with Debby, but I think some of the earlier works that I read, the characters were quite noble in face of their persecution. And I think maybe we're seeing a little bit more of, we're allowed to be human now, like we've established maybe that, we are valid, we're legitimate. And so that was a wrong with the reparation. I think there was this sense of this was an acknowledged wrong, even though there are still hidden stories that were suppressed. But I think there's this sense that we can be human. We don't have to be perfect. We don't have to be stoic.
I love that. And I just think that really speaks to the power of having, I think, badass women like all of you in the role as the author to continue to see representation in literature, folks unpacking their own, stories. And so I just really appreciate all of your work and your time today. And I can't wait to, see everything you do in the future and join your book releases coming up. And I hope everyone who's hanging out in the comments will check them out. Let us know what you think, and catch the book releases. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Tia.
Thank you, friends. Thank you, Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to all you watching.